I have recently added a new tutorial to my online shoemaking course on how to make cowboy boots, and they were easier than you think to make from home. I did it all on a flatbed domestic sewing machine, and I thought I'd give you a quick run through now on the steps that I took to make them. So first things first, whenever you're making a boot, is that you need to start by making the patterns. Now, because the last itself actually ends sort of before the ankle area, what I needed to do was build up the leg of the last using paper. The main reason for making this leg of the last is that we want to get the angle correct so that the boot is going up the leg at the correct angle and not sort of going off to the side at all. This is also a great opportunity to help us get the measurements right so that it actually fits on our leg. Next, we're going to make a master pattern. Now, the pattern making process with boots can be a little bit long because we always do a mock-up, which means that we'll usually do our first pattern, make the mock-up, and then make changes to it, and then do our final pattern. So the purpose of the master pattern is really to help us get, like I said before, the measurements correct and just the general design of the boot in the position that we want. Once we've got the master pattern done, we make a mock-up out of scrap leather, and I always like to do that so that I can try it on, and that way I can make any changes to the pattern so that the final shoe is a bit more perfect. So in this case, I actually raised the height of the pattern by about 2 centimeters to make it sit a bit higher on the leg, and I also had to adjust the angle a little bit. Even though I had done the leg of the last, it still seemed to be tilting forward a little bit too much, so I twisted the whole thing backwards a little bit to give us a better shape, and that worked actually really beautifully, because when I made the final shoe, the angle was absolutely perfect. When doing the final pattern, I also used this as an opportunity to add in a few extra pieces to give the boot a little bit more character. So for example, I added some additional panels on the toe, the heel, and also I gave these 2 little tabs on the side as well, which just helped to pull the boot on and off the foot really nice and easily. I also used this opportunity to draw on some design features that I wanted to do as a contrasting stitch, and made sure that I'd marked them out on the pattern exactly where I wanted them to sit on the final shoe. When it came time to make the real deal, or the final boot, I started by cutting out all of my upper pieces and my lining pieces using the final patterns that I'd made. I had to be really careful to keep them as separate lefts and rights, because once you've sort of got lots of different pieces, it can be very easy to mix the shoes up. So I kept them very separate. I then also was sure to take my safety beveler and just skive away any of the additional bulk which were on the areas of the pieces that were going to be joined together. So pretty much seams and underlays. Once I'd reduced that bulk, I then moved on to stitching in all of my decorative stitching. The heat erasable pen was my absolute best friend for this process, because it meant that I actually had a line to follow when I was doing the stitching, and just allowed me to make the stitching really neat, which I'm super happy with how it turned out. And then of course I just blasted it with a heat gun afterwards to remove any of the pen marks. Once I'd done all my decorative stitching, I could start actually piecing together all of the separate pieces, and that was a little bit easier said than done, because these are quite curvy pattern pieces, so I did have to really manipulate the leather to get it to sit exactly where it should. But this leather was really nice and malleable, so I got it all into place and then stitched it all together. Once I'd stitched all of the pieces together for the upper, I then went ahead and added in my lining, making sure to glue the shaft of the boot, or the leg of the boot, together so that the lining and the upper were really nice and sealed on the inside without any wrinkles. With my uppers completed, I could move on to the actual lasting of the shoe, and I needed my insoles before I could go ahead and do that. So I cut out my insoles to fit exactly the base of my lasts, and while I was at it, I decided to also make a pattern for my insole sock at this stage, just so that once I'd actually lasted the whole shoe, I would have that ready for the end, because it's really tricky to do that once you've actually lasted a boot around the insole. So once I'd cut out my insoles and I had them perfect to the shape of the bottom of the last, I then moved on to lasting the linings, which is where I placed the upper of the boot over the top of the lasts, stretched it really nice and tight over the last, securing it to the insole at the bottom, and then I went ahead and reduced as much bulk as I possibly could from the underside of the boot. Once I had these in place and I checked that the heights of my boots matched, I then went ahead and inserted my stiffeners. So in this boot, I put in a toe puff stiffener at the toe section and a counter stiffener at the heel, which are basically what help keep the shoe in shape when you actually take the last out of it. And they both went in reasonably easy. I did have to mark on my back height so that I knew where my counter needed to go up to. And that was a really important step that I feel like people could really easily forget and then like not really put their stiffeners to the right spot or not have them matching on both boots. So yeah, I really recommend you get that back height marked on before you do that step. Once the stiffeners were in, we could go ahead and last the upper leather, which actually worked really, really easily. I added quite a bit of extra lasting allowance to the pattern on these boots just to make sure that I had enough to get over, but I'd actually given myself a bit too much in the end, so I had to cut quite a bit of excess off the bottom, but it's always better to have too much than not enough in these scenarios, so I wasn't mad about it. And I absolutely love this stage because this is when they really start to look like finished boots and all of your hard work starts to really pay off at this stage. But we're not finished yet. We then moved on to the soles. So I decided on this boot that I was going to be putting on a randing, which is like a mock welt. It gives a kind of stitched detail around the outside of the boot. And I really wanted mine to be black, even though my randing was a natural veg tan color. So I decided to add in an extra step here and edge dye my randing black. Once that had had time to dry, I went ahead and glued it onto the base of the boot. I then made a sole pattern to fit right up to the edge of the randing, cut out some soles and glued them onto the base of the shoe as well. At this stage, I gave the whole thing a really good sand down on the sides and then edge dyed the whole sides so that I was edge dyeing the randing and the sole at the same time, so we had a really nice clean black chunky sole. At that point I could go ahead and remove the lasts from the boots. This is not easy, but it's super satisfying when you finally get the last out of there because it means you can actually try it on, and I was really, really happy to find that mine fit perfectly, which shouldn't have come as a surprise because that was the whole point in doing a mock-up in the first place. After that was done, I went ahead and drilled in my heels. I then made some foam insole socks to give them a little extra comfort inside, glued them in, and then voila, we have our finished boots. So boot making from home isn't as difficult as you'd think, and if you want to watch the full step-by-step tutorial, you can find it inside my online shoemaking course at ICANMAKESHOES.com. And I hope you found that run through helpful.